The health warning. Peter was this successful worker in his company, shrewdly climbing the business ladder, making very good decisions, getting promoted, until one day, in a moment of madness, he took an enormous risk in a deal. He overemphasized his company's profits to seal the deal. And afterwards he realized, I've been caught. He was honest enough to go to his line manager and say exactly what he'd done, to own up to what had happened. But unfortunately, the move had so compromised the ethics of the company to such a degree, the only way out was for Peter to go. Quietly, non-disclosure agreements were signed, and Peter found a different job. Within a few moments, Peter heard from a previous work colleague that the risk he had taken proved to be not so mad after all. If anything, it had launched the company to an entirely different level of operations. And so Peter felt justified in going back to the company and saying, could we review what had happened? Could I have my job back? They said no. So Peter left, carrying wounds of bitterness, and he never fully recovered. Today we come to that part in Hebrews 12 called the unshakable kingdom, this beautiful passage, this inheritance that we all have access to through our mediator, Jesus Christ. This Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. We don't need to go to this mountain and approach it in fear the way Moses did at Mount Sinai, because through Jesus we have confidence that this inheritance is already ours. But this story carries a health warning. Just before this passage that we read this morning, there's another story of two brothers, this family. The firstborn was entitled to his inheritance, but in a moment of madness and trying to seal a deal, he'd come home from a busy day's work. He was starving. He simply wanted food. And when his younger brother came to him and said, I'm going to give you food if you give me your inheritance, he said, all right, I'll do it. And with that, the deal was sealed. Esau swore away his entire birthright for his evening dinner. Short-term gain for long-term misery. When he realized the implications of what he'd done, he went to his father and tried to renegotiate, tried to get back into the family inheritance to plead his cause, but they said no. And Esau left carrying wounds, and the bitterness grew, and he never fully recovered. And the writer in Hebrews says, don't be like Esau. Don't get bitter. There's so much we don't know about the context of Hebrews. You can imagine, but we don't fully know where it was written, when it was written, who wrote it. But we do know that for these Christians, life was hard. They were tired. They were realizing this Christian life is not a sprint. It's a long marathon of endurance, many obstacles, but you have to keep going. And you can understand why the Christians were tired. They were underneath the empire still. Some Christians said, well, we'll just keep collaborating with this governing force. We don't like it, but it's the only option. We'll acquiesce. Others adopted this stance of minimal cooperation. We really don't like the Roman Empire, but we'll cooperate at the least level possible. Others withdrew altogether. I'm going to get out of this place. Let's find another way of living in Christian community. Others fought in uprisings and rebellions. And then in the mix of the Christian community, you had the Jewish believers who were increasingly feeling uncomfortable in their place of worship, in the synagogue. They realized that the cost of following Jesus was beginning to mark them out as different from their tribe, the tribe that they'd been born into their whole life. And they were wondering, is it really worth all this? Is it worth this? We've this beautifully constructed temple, this beautiful law. Maybe we should just go back to the heart of it all and forget about the one called Messiah. There were Christians who'd been persecuted so brutally under the Roman Empire. They were traumatized, having to leave their roots, leave their security, leave their possessions. And it was hard for them to even think about hope, to think about a future. What does that look like anymore? And then there were the Gentile Christians, the immigrants, who were watching all this going on with the Jews, watching what was happening, trying to figure out, where do I fit into all of this? Do I belong, or will I forever be on the outside? So many pressures in the early church, lots of frustrations, lots of frequent rebellions, congregations that were trying to worship but exhausted, tired of serving, tired of worship, tired of being this peculiar breed of people called Christians. And so their hands were drooping, their knees were weak, church attendance was down, their confidence was low. Tired of walking the walk, tired of talking the talk. Maybe the best thing is just walk away altogether. Have you reached that moment of madness where you're ready to let go of the inheritance and exchange it because you're tired and you just want a quick fix? A practical atheism that's making you play fast and loose with everything that you've staked your life on in Christ? Come with me to these two mountains, Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. One offers the Esau solution, the quick fix, and one offers rescue. Mount Sinai is this place where Moses stood and received the law, this terrifying place. It burned like a volcano. The clouds were dark and brooding. There were strong winds and earthquakes, and the almighty voice of God was terrible and terrifying. It was feeling like the darkness of Mordor. Even innocent animals, if they dared step on this mountain, they would be put to death. It was an unapproachable mountain. And this is the place without resurrection. Do you remember how the Corinthians began to doubt their faith? Do I really believe that Jesus died and rose again? And they said these words, if Christ has not been raised and the dead are not raised, then we might as well say, like Esau, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's short-term soothing for a life of misery. It may feel like comfort, but in the long run, it's a construct. It's loneliness. And when shaken, it's not going to last. It will fall away because it's not to do with eternal life and resurrection. The deep irony in how we get to Mount Zion, this unshakable kingdom, is that we need to be thoroughly shaken in order to get there. To have our lives so turned upside down that we're no longer like the adults who think we know how the story goes, but we become like children, like little children who don't know anything, but they're dependent on the hand that feeds them. Like Psalm 131, the weaned child. Do you remember those little babies that you had, and they cried as if they would never see food in their life again? That desperate cry. And then once they were fed, they were quiet again. And then within 2 hours, they cried again as if they were never going to have food for the rest of their life. And on it went, those cycles of feeding and resting, until they realized these people who've raise me up. We can rely on them. They're going to provide over and over again, and the promise of presence brings peace and contentment, and the child begins to grow up assured. That's the promise of this kingdom, but you can't get there by being an adult. You must become a little child and say to God, I don't know where I'm going. Show me the way. I'm dependent on you. Placing your trust in God who can do the impossible. And that's the exact opposite of the modern world. This week I've been reading the book Leadership, God's Agency and Disruption by Roxburgh and Branson. And they say in this modern world, human life and human agency becomes the primary force. We make the world, we construct the world. Earth becomes this construct that humans make rather than a gift for which we are simply the stewards of. To be human is to be the maker. And they talk about this phrase that the German social theorist Sloterdijk calls in his book, The Anthropocene. He coined the term Kinetic Expressionism, where we use things by force. We use fossil fuels, we use atomic energy and power and agency, all to express the understanding that we are free, we're autonomous, and we're the ones who make projects out of this world. But in God's scheme, it's different. It's no longer humans that are the main players. It's God. God is the central agent in making this world, in sustaining this world. And the only way we can get to see that is if our little worlds become disrupted. When our lives get so shaken up that our attention begins to shift away from all that we do, from our security and our acquisition, and by humility we begin to look for God again. That's why Jesus spoke in parables that turned the world upside down. Jesus said, your faith must be this small, like a mustard seed. Even if it's this small, it can move a mountain. Perhaps it can even move Mount Sinai so that instead you see Mount Zion. Faith as small as a mustard seed, as long as its object is Jesus. Because you see, this kinetic force, this strong force that we all have to control the world, to be in control of our lives, it can only be disrupted, not by kinetic force, but by kenotic force, kenosis, the life of Jesus, who made himself nothing. Jesus, who becomes little like a baby, who can't tend to himself or feed himself. This Jesus who instead of coming as a king becomes a servant and says to his disciples, let me show how much I love you. And he gets down on his knees and he washes his disciples' feet. And before the cross, when Jesus is praying in Gethsemane and knows what lies ahead of him, he says to God, I'm just not sure I can get through. I'm just not sure I can do this. I'd love there to be another way. But Jesus stayed with God, dependent on God the Father for everything. And so Roxburgh and Branson say when the kinetic is placed alongside the kenotic, when power is limited to one in which God as agent is made absent, then this dialectic disappears and resurrection happens. And that's what's happening on Mount Zion, resurrection. This place that was once captured by King David in victory in Jerusalem. Now the new King David captures it again, but not through force, but rather through love on a cross, through vulnerability, through relinquishing absolutely everything and committing himself to God who would do resurrection. And so We have an invitation to come to this mountain. And it's not like Mount Sinai where there's darkness and all these foreboding clouds, where there's constructed identities of how we control our image to the world, and we're really lonely. But instead, we're in a place where God says, look at the angels. There's thousands of them, thousands and thousands of joyful angels who are just delighted that you're here. Look at the firstborns, the spirit of the righteous, people who have walked the walk and talked the talk and got to the end. They're here with you. You're not alone. You're not alone in the Christian life. It may feel like as if you're the only one who's had this hard week and you're struggling, but you're not alone. And you've been made perfect through Jesus Christ. God the judge is here. God the judge who sees everything, not in this terrible way, but a judge we can celebrate because God will put everything right again. God is committed to that. God will do that. And so we approach this mountain, this Mount Zion, because of Jesus, the one whose blood was sprinkled. And it says in Hebrews, this blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Do you remember that story? 2 other brothers. Cain, in his moment of madness, kills Abel. He thought he'd got away with it. But God said to Cain, what have you done? Even the ground is crying out. The blood that was sprinkled on the ground is crying out against the violent injustice. God sees it all. For every act of violence in a family home where victims of abuse suffer silently and wonder if there's any justice, Jesus says, I see you. I see what you've been through. And Jesus steps into that place and offers his own body and blood, knowing God is judge, knowing that death will one day be defeated, and knowing that one day the cycles of violence and retribution will be finished forever. And the work of the cross will offer forgiveness and freedom and hope and peace. But the thing is, we can only get to Zion through disruption, through having the foundations of our lives totally shaken. On Wednesday night, I went to our church meal here feeling disrupted. Like many of you, I was watching the posts on Facebook in our closed group. So much pain, disappointment. Disappointment in denomination, disappointment in our congregation, disappointment in us as leaders. And I felt disrupted. I felt the pain. And after dinner, I hadn't planned to, but I stayed to listen to Naji and Anne, Naji Umran and Anne Zaki, and their work in Egypt. And their main idea that night was that for God's kingdom to advance, it only happens through disruption. Some of you know Anne's story. She lectures in seminary in Egypt, training Presbyterian students to become ordained ministers. And the tremendous irony, she has all these credentials, and yet the denomination will not allow her to be ordained as a woman. And she's tried, and others have tried, brought it to the General Assembly, and it's always been no. Until 2016, this had become an endless round. The General Assembly decided to put an embargo on the topic of female ordination for the next decade. We're not going to talk about it for the next decade. Can you imagine? That's disruption. And Anne, as she was telling her story on Wednesday night, said, if that disruption had not happened, I wouldn't have gone to Fuller to get my PhD. If that disruption had not have happened, it would have meant I didn't get the PhD, which I needed to go and stay in the seminary and continue teaching students. And the thing is, now that I'm in this seminary, I get to interact with students. And then the students invite me to go out to their places of worship and to preach. And so little boys and little girls get to see a female preacher, and they get inspired. And they get to see that God can speak through any vessel that God wants to speak. And Anne says, that disruption made me realize it's not about fighting for my right anymore. It's about living for others. It's about this unshakable kingdom for the next generation. Yes, it was so painful to have General Assembly put a ban on decision-making, but it forced me to look at the bigger picture of Christ at work in the next generation. That's the kingdom. Mount Sinai says, focus on yourself. It dares you to think you're not good enough, so just keep trying. And you only become more isolated and lonely in the process. Mount Zion says, welcome. Keep moving forward in faith. Jesus has done for you what you couldn't do for yourself. So anytime you have a deep disturbance or dissatisfaction, come back to me like the weaned child. See the fullness of life. And when you do that, you realize you're not alone. You have thousands of angels with you. You have a congregation to encourage you to keep going. And so, yes, maybe there is a shaking and a disruption that's happening, not just here, but further afield, denominationally. But maybe the challenge is to see Christ in others, to see the light of Christ. In Mount Sinai, earthquakes simply meant destruction, things that die. But in Mount Zion, the purpose of earthquakes is different. Things are shaken up so that what's not supposed to last gets shaken away. I like to imagine it's a beautiful piece of art that has dust on it, and when it's shaken, the dust falls off, and you see beauty. That's the purpose of earthquakes in Mount Zion. God allows you to go through shaking so that the true beauty of Christ may be seen in you. And if any of you have met Anne Zaki, you know what I mean. You see the beauty of Christ. One of my favorite movies is River Runs Through It, that Presbyterian man's family in Montana, and there's these two brothers. The older is just perfect, paragon of virtue, living by the book, excelling in class till one day he gets the right job, marries the right girl, and then the younger brother, he's just a tearaway. Drinks too much, gambles, takes risks, never out of trouble. And the tragedy of the story is the older brother watches his younger brother all the time, always watching and always trying to bring rescue, trying to save him, trying to get him away from the gambling and the drinking, but he just can't save him. That's the tragedy. But the good news for us today is that Hebrews says you have an older brother who'll look out for you. An older brother who's not like Esau, who'll throw away beauty in exchange for the quick fix of a dinner. Not like the Cain and Abel, who are at each other out of hatred. Or even the older brother in A River Runs Through It who can't fix. He sees the pain but can't fix. No, we have an older brother who says, I see your pain today. I know your deepest anxiety about the future, that life does feel uncertain. I know your worst fears. I see you in your darkest hour. I know your tightly held wounds, even from this week. And I'm here for them all. I'm going to bring rescue so you can be thankful. And so the posture I invite you to have when you leave this place is simply one of thanksgiving, because it prevents the bitter root from growing. This is what Hebrews 12 says to finish. Do you see how thankful you must be? Not just thankful, but brimming with worship. reverent before God. God is not this indifferent bystander. God is actively cleaning the house, torching all that needs to burn. And God won't quit until it's all cleansed. God himself is this consuming fire. And so I invite you to keep your eyes on God. The mighty fortress is our God. The sacred refuge is God's name. His kingdom is unshakable. With God forever, we're called to reign. So we will keep our eyes on you. 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 Keep your eyes on Jesus Christ.